Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Teacher's Point of View. Really pleased to have Allan here today. He's the principal of Ealing Independent College. I mean, he's had a remarkable career and he's actually a new head teacher, so congratulations on your recent achievement. I know obviously there's a lot of pressure on taking over a school, but taking over a school during the pandemic, Jesus Christ, my hat goes off to you. So really well done. I mean, could you just introduce yourself, Allan, and kind of explain to everyone what the journey you've been on to get to where you are?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And thanks for the congratulations. It's not a poison chalice here, so that's really, really good. It's actually been an enjoyable step forward. So that's been great. Yeah, I mean, just in terms of my journey into the profession and up the profession, really, I became a teacher in 2004. I joined a special measures school and really stuck it out there. It was quite challenging to start off with. And I think in many ways that was probably the best introduction to teaching that I could have really asked for. Tough kids, some tough classes, but that's good. That hardens you up and it makes you really ready for a lot of the things that the profession throws at you. Also within that school as well, which was in Milton Keynes, I really worked with some great teachers who I could take a lot from. They'd got some really hard and fast rules on how to deal with kids and how to really get the best out of them. And I thought, yeah, this is great. I learned a lot there. And then I just really started looking for promotion when I felt like I'd really mastered the place and I couldn't really do much more. I went to a wonderful school after that for 4 years. I was head of history, a school called Wadston that was in sort of South Buckinghamshire. Really, really nice school, really supportive, wonderful, wonderful kids. Loved being head of history there. Did a lot of exciting things there. We set up like a kind of sort of video logging area, that kind of stuff. And then I did something that I was really, really proud of, which was that I turned a really drab, dreary corridor into a sort of come to life history corridor, which was where I used the help of an artistic impressionist, I think they call it. And we were able to transform that corridor into a World War I trench that looked really quite inviting for kids to be in the school. One of the things I really enjoyed within that was where school tours, they tended to always start in the really up-to-date library or in the sports hall where all the kids were throwing netballs and all that kind of stuff. A lot of the school tours then started to come to the history corridor because we had something that a lot of schools just didn't have really. As I say, Wadston was a great school for me. But like many really, really good, strong schools, I think a lot of middle leaders could get stuck there and stay there for the rest of their career, quite satisfied, not really pushing themselves. But I found that for me, it was best to push on to a new place. And I became head of humanities at a school in High Wycombe. Again, quite challenging kids, but good, really quite strong school, lots of really great staff there. And again, that really pushed me to get a new level. I think, again, like if you're in a really nice school for a long time, it can sort of give you that position where you're not pushing yourself out the boundaries. You're quite safe. And this is why I think it's quite important every maybe 3, 4, 5 years that a teacher looks for a new challenge if they're not getting professional kind of expansion and extension to the role within their current school. I was at the school in High Wycombe for a couple of years. Then within that time, maybe just before actually moving to that school in High Wycombe, I met who is now my wife, and we decided that the right thing for her to do in her career was to move into London, and she became an architect. And I was looking for a school in London, and Ealing looked like an interesting project, so to speak. A lot smaller school, different challenges. But I decided to take a job as head of humanities and head of GCSE, which is a pastoral role, which is not usually what I wanted to do, but I wanted to extend my repertoire. And so I went into that, really enjoyed that. We had some really great kids, challenging kids again, but turned them around and made them do really well. And from then on, I mean, I've been here for the last 6 years. I've been, as I say, a pastoral leader. I've also led academically. I became director of studies and then vice principal for 3 years. And then last year, with the principal moving on because of retirement, I was given the chance to become principal of the college. And it's been great. Yeah, I've really enjoyed it since September. Like you say, taking over in a pandemic's not easy. But yeah, it's just added to that kind of idea that within this profession, it's no 2 days are the same. And I can still say that within a pandemic, within the profession, yes, no 2 days are the same. Even though for a lot of the day I'm sitting in the same chair, staring into the same screen. Yeah, the days are still different and still really exciting.
Amazing. I mean, you obviously talk about kind of when you went over to Ealing and it being a different project and it had its own challenges. I mean, obviously, like independent schools it's kind of perceived to be in a certain way at times. I mean, like what do you find? What did you find were the challenges when you came over to that school?
I think independent schools in a weird way are sort of, and this is a good thing, they're sort of out with regulation that maybe an Ofsted would do in that. Ofsted, in the way that it's come to see schools and come to visit schools, because its tentacles are out there, and there's always this kind of weird feeling that Ofsted's always looking and Big Brother's always looking. There are certain standards that you're kind of, you sort of think of state schools as. You've got obviously always qualified teachers, certain rules that are always there, and so on and so forth. Independent schools, I just feel that they've got that sort of slightly more freedom to go and do things their way. And that little bit of freedom can add character and personality to a school in a way that certain state schools, they try and rail against. And it's almost a case of state schools, to me, although they have their own character and their own personality, their own set of rules and ethos and all that kind of stuff, within our school, certainly, I mean, one of the big differences, for instance, is that students, they don't wear a uniform here. We don't really look at that as one of the big key things. As long as the student's really comfortable and they want to learn and they've got the right mindset, we think that that's a really key thing, rather than, for instance, if I was in certain state schools, to be seeing a kid who walks a couple of steps in the door and I'm already having a go at them for how many stripes are on their tie, or if their shirt's untucked, or if the top button's not quite done, which, yes, it's important in a big school where the rules and the compliance and getting that message across about it being important to stay up to certain standards is really, really important. And I absolutely get that. But within the independent school that I'm now in, the flexibility and the ability to take students sort of at their own means and to build that personal one-to-one relationship with them to get the best out of them, I quite enjoy that every day. It's in a sense, it's a bit like education on a personal level, a personal one-to-one level, and it's far more collaborative than perhaps that distance between teacher and student is in a state school, where there are rules that you really must adhere to, or there are big consequences. Here we just find a way, and I think the sort of passion and vision that we're trying to make happen here is that we're trying to get the best out of the kids whatever way we can, and there's a flexibility to do that. And we don't really get to the point here where it's like it's my way or the highway. We'll mold a kid, or we'll try and find a way to just get the best out of a student, and that's what we try and do here, which is good.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there is this big focus in sometimes in state secondary schools where behaviour is such an issue. I mean, not that behaviour is such an issue, but there's such a big focus on behaviour. And there's a lot of people within the profession that almost argue that what you're doing is factorising children and you're making them a product of the system. I mean, do you find this validity in that statement?
I do. However, I mean, it's really important to say that I'm not also disagreeing with it. I really recognise that when you get a school which has got 1,200 kids, there needs to be rules. And when you start going into schools where the behaviour and the standards has been allowed to slip, you can see the really bad effects of it. Because what you're trying to do in a school, I think, is to gain an ethos and a sense that everybody's there to do their best. And if certain students can see that X, Y, and Z student, or he gets away with untucking his shirt, and he gets away with chewing gum, or he gets away with this, so I'm going to do it too. And when you start allowing those standards to slightly slip, I can see how the whole thing can fall apart. I mean, from our perspective at the college, we in a sense, we don't place all that emphasis on the outward image of discipline, as in, are our kids coming to school with bright, shiny shoes and it's all looking absolutely perfect and spotless? What we tend to place it on is, right, well, what we are never going to let you get away with as a student is a slightly shoddy attitude to your work, and effort and things like that. For that, and I've said this to students in assembly all through this year, effort for me will always trump attainment. So I want to see the kids here who will give their absolute damnedest and give their absolute all and slog their guts out, even if it means the best that they can do is a C grade. I'd far rather have those students in my college than the ones who are waltzing in. They've got wonderful talent and wonderful potential, and when they really should be getting an A star, they lazily make their way to a B grade. So for us, effort is the big thing. And if they come in and really show that they're willing to give it their all, that to me is far more important than a uniform and making sure that they're compliant with every rule. Because behaviour, and I'm very lucky to say it here, it's not a big thing. It's not a big worry for us. We don't have big infractions every day. Yes, we'll still have kids who will try and push the boundaries, but in a sense, that's okay with me. I kind of like the students who do that. I like the slightly naughtier students, because they're the ones who push your buttons, and they're the ones who show you what sort of teacher you are in terms of how you respond. And they're the ones who, when you get to the end of a year and you get to the end of a GCSE or an A Level programme and they've got what their potential says it is, and beyond that, they're the ones that you're the most proud at getting there.
Sure. I mean, I know you kind of understand why you have to have the structure and the behaviour in the other schools. But like when you're talking to like FTSE 100 companies, or when you're talking to certain people within the profession, they're very much encourage individuality and learning your kids and actually encouraging them to be themselves. But when you are having a model like that, where behaviour is so structured, when you have silent corridors, when you have like those behaviour management systems in place, you almost do create. You do almost kill individuality in some respects, because what you're doing is you're literally training everyone to be like each other. I mean, how detrimental can that be for people, for students that are going through a system like that?
It's a really good question. I mean, it doesn't happen here, and I can see the effects on it, and I can see kids really gaining confidence, because we do have a lot of students who come to us who are school refusers, and maybe they just don't fit in with that system. They don't fit in with, right, you must comply with this or that's it. And I know that we've also got certain students, for instance, who have certain disorders where they'll rail against these rules because they believe them to be a certain injustice, right? Where you've got rules within a classroom where, right, you get 3 warnings, then you're out. And people will instantly then, certain students just feel like they're getting picked on and feel like there's something really wrong with that. Now, I agree that certain things can really push students towards being, for want of a certain phrase, like robots, and they'll all be the same. But I think as long as you've got a certain ethos that underpins it, like one of the schools that I worked in over my career was Wadston, where the big ethos was just very much dignity and respect towards all others. Now, they also went down corridors on one side. They also had a pretty, not a ridiculously strict uniform, but expectations were required. But for them, the big key thing was how students were to themselves and each other and to the teachers. Were they respectful? Did they show dignity towards them? That was the big key thing. And I think, yes, it's a danger that you could load in totally and absolutely on behaviour, and there must be certain schools up and down the country that don't have a grasp on it, and so they must go that way. But I think as long as it comes down to student character and student personality and student effort, and that's more important than these behaviour things, that'll be all right. But yeah, I can understand why certain people want that to be the case. And yeah, I totally take your point. And it's why I feel actually really fortunate to be running a school where it's not a big thing. I don't need to go into classrooms and there are things that have happened in the past in certain schools that I've been in, where there was a whole big thing with certain students, certain female students, who the big thing about the skirts being too short and getting heads of years out with meter sticks to measure and all this kind of stuff. I mean, where's the educational value in that? It just, you're right, we've got to sort of think about education and effort and personal traits and characteristics that make students not just better students, but better potential leaders and workers within their fields. And that's right. It's just what you as a principal, I guess, feels is most important to the running of your school.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously, if look, ultimately, some inner city London schools, the behaviour is really, really bad, right? And ultimately, they need structure. But is there an alternative just to put behaviour management policies in place? I mean, is there another way that they can take grasp and control of behaviour within schools, opposed to just make it regimented and obviously factorise kids, so to speak, as some professionals within the industry would say?
I mean, it's difficult. I mean, there probably needs to be some kind of real kind of research done into it. I mean, I know, for instance, that there are certain schools in London that have had big problems, but then they've got certain leaders within the community and sportsmen, people like that, who have come in and really like taken certain groups of boys and told them, look, what are you doing with your life? Sort yourself out and do this and do that, and really led by example on them, and that's really worked. Whereas if you just looked at these boys and said, right, your shirt's not tucked in, your tie's not done right, all that kind of stuff, you're immediately going into a negative. And it's no wonder that they don't think schools work for them then. I think it's all down to time and investment in these students and showing them that you really care. That's one of the critical things. And possibly not just showing them that you care, but also showing the parents that you really care. When a parent sees that a teacher really, really cares about the student, I can only say, as a father to a 2-year-old girl, that it means a huge amount to you to say, like, they're like key workers come out and said, oh, she was just so wonderful today, she did this, and it just made me so proud. And maybe that just doesn't get said enough. One of the things that I've always sort of thought is there's so much negative email and negative comments and so on that get sent back to parents. What about those positives? Even if it's a very small positive, like just to be able to say, well, student X said this in the lesson, and I was just taken aback completely by just how brilliant they were. Yeah. And one of the things that I've really tried to instill here, not just towards staff, but also towards students, is like, you've done something great. Like, take pleasure in that. And also just think about, like, just being a bit more proud of yourself, because that's good. You've made a big difference.
I think the big problem here is that a lot of times schools are run by fear. So head teachers run by fear of what Ofsted thinks or the league tables, and then the senior leadership team kind of follow suit. They're worried about what the head teacher's thinking, and then the children absorb that energy in some respects, and they're in fear of not passing their exams, and the whole school is then like transformed in it and ran in through fear opposed to enthusiasm and passion and actually inspiration. And I think the very key point that you made is to focus on the positives, because you look at negative and positive reinforcement psychology. Like if a child is not getting any positive reinforcement and they act out and you give them negative reinforcement, well, actually they've got your attention now. So what you're going to find is that will multiply those negative attitudes. However, if you like kind of point out the good things that they're doing, I mean, what you'll find is that those will multiply. So I mean, we have this really poor tendency in the UK to really isolate those kids that are doing poorly, but are we understanding why they're doing poorly, or are we understanding why they're acting out? So is that the alternative to make sure that instead of pushing these children out to alternative provisions, and so to speak? Because I did actually speak to a head teacher from an alternative provision, and he said that the kids were too easily let go. It's almost like some of these children have gone through trauma. They've gone through they come from deprived backgrounds or broken families, or they don't have any role models in their life. So to go into school and then to get rejected from the school, it's almost like they're kind of being told that they're never going to be good enough, and they get to the alternative provision, and it's for them to then inspire them. But do schools need to step up more and actually make a genuine more effort to get to know their kids better and deal with those traumas?
I think that's a really good point. And again, I think this is a big mind shift or a mindset shift that's required. You made a good point, which is, again, back to league tables and so on and so forth. And that could impact on students saying they need to get rid of this kid really, really quickly and almost fast track their exclusion, which is just horrendous. What a horrendous thing to say about any kid, or his exclusion was fast tracked. But I mean, we've got a student here who was very, very close to going to a PRU, to an alternative unit. And to be honest, he's not been absolutely perfect this year. He's got himself into a bit of a scrap and stuff like that, but that's fine. You talk that through, and you get down to what's really important to him. And we found out that the big absolute key for him is he's really, really interested in business. So we've done stuff for him. We've really laid on stuff to help him with his GCSE business. His mathematics has been brilliant, and he's mocky got a grade 7. So it's clinging onto those positives. And one of the big things within those positives is we make sure that a lot of that goes home to his parents, so that when he gets home, the first thing he's not seeing from his parents is, oh, I heard what happened at school today, it was horrendous. And again, he's getting that negative as soon as he comes in. And it's all about building on that positive. Because I'm sure you know, certainly in your field and other fields within business, the negative reviews and all that kind of stuff, their impact is 20 times what any positive review is. And we've got to be really, really careful about that. And I think students accept that too. I'm not trying to say it's very important to be this kind of wishy-washy, oh, aren't you wonderful, lovey-dovey to every single kid. But there's got to be this kind of idea that kids can do right as well as they can do wrong. And when that right happens, we've got to recognize that. And we've got to make a lot more of that. I mean, one of the big things I wanted to do here as principal at the end of my first term was change the whole reward structure we had. We tend to give out quite a lot of rewards at the end of each term. And in years gone by, it was very elitist. It was very kind of, right, this girl got 4 A grades, well done, superb, you've won an award. And you tended to find that the only kids who got awards were the ones who were getting A's and A stars. And I've changed that. I've changed that to success against targets, and I've changed that to wider contribution and dedication to the ethos of the school and all that kind of stuff. So people who decided to give up their Saturday and come in and paint a student common room, they were getting awards just as well as every kid who was getting A star AA. And that's what you've got to create, because you're right. You can't just create a system where the only successful kids are the ones who are getting perfect exam results. We've got to look at a system where there are awards and success bestowed upon kids who can come in here and really create a better environment for everybody else too.
Absolutely. And in some respects, you obviously talk about kind of like awarding those children that not only the children that do well in exams, right? So I mean it's brilliant that you're rewarding them, but ultimately what it's going to come down to for them is the grades that they get, and that's what's going to open doors for them or not open those doors for them in some respects. I mean, and obviously there's only so much you can do as a school in terms of trying to celebrate the things that they do while they're there. But when they leave, I mean, is it fair on these kids that their whole lives depend on these set of grades when they might have more to them in the things that you see?
Well, yeah, well, absolutely not is the answer to that. It's been too long where the grades come first, and that's another thing that we've tried to do to just change it and shift it slightly. One thing that we've brought in for A-level students has been a lot harder to do this year, and so I can't profess to have done it exactly how I wanted to do it, but we're bringing in pathways for different groups of kids. So for instance, those kids who really come to me and say, look, I want to get into medicine. I know that my grades aren't going to make me get there, but I want to get into medicine. And it's providing those opportunities, providing the ability that they know that they can go and hook up for this podcast or this little bit of experience, or finding a way that they can shadow a nurse or get into a pharmacy or whatever. And it's providing those, like, it is soft skills to begin with, but it's also the ability to have people skills, because I would absolutely hate for a student to come out of here with A star, A star, A star, get into medicine and not have the first idea about how to communicate with people and how to make them feel at ease with them and stuff like that. We've got to do more to make people more than these grades. But I think you're absolutely right. The big problem is that you get wonderful candidates applying for UCAS to certain universities who are deep down amazing, wonderful candidates, but because they've missed out by 1 grade on something, they're dismissed straight away, they're thrown in the bin, and that's it, dream over and all that kind of stuff. There's got to be a way of looking at these kids and what they can really bring, and that's what we're trying to do a little bit more here as well. Like I say, the pandemic's halted that somewhat, but that's not stopped us trying.
Yeah, for sure. I think, like, even as an employer, I think from my perspective, when I look at GCSE grades, in some respects, I'd never look at GCSE grades. So, I mean, how relevant are they? Because ultimately, really and truly, the first time, any grades that you're really going to look at are A levels and your university degree, if you're going to look at, if you're ever going to look at grades or academics. So, I mean, are we testing these children way too young? I mean, are we putting too much pressure on them and not helping them find their niche and helping them really excel in their passion?
Yeah, and you can go back further than that. You can go back to SATs and you can go back to 11 pluses and stuff like that. There's probably too much testing. Yeah, I mean, I know in certain countries, you've got like Finland, places like that, where testing doesn't come in anywhere near as much as we do here. It's very, very difficult to avoid, in some senses, certain kids being of a mind where they feel like they're perhaps defined by these tests and defined by these scores. I'll never amount to this, I'll never amount to that. And that's why it's really important that although for certain students, maybe the dream's never going to become a reality, that you got to keep encouraging, enthusing them to try and get to it. And that's really important to me. Yeah, I agree with you that there are tests there. I think GCSE is probably it's about the right time to really get something down and show how good they are. And we've got to find a way though where it's going to be reflective of what they're really at. I mean, you look back a few years and Michael Gove, as Education Secretary, decided that he'd get rid of coursework in certain subjects. And I understand why he did that. Absolutely. I understand that there were certain schools who were playing the system and gaming the system and you were ending up with certain courseworks that were 100% and then a kid would go and set an exam that was 70% and so on and so forth. But there's a reality there that system wasn't working, so we changed it. But I think the current system's certainly not perfect as it is. And we need to look into changing that too. And you're probably right, to be honest, looking forward, looking at employers and sort of saying to them, look, what do you want? Yeah. What do you want most of all? What would you value most of all here? And maybe it's a case where, yeah, you still keep GCSEs, but we have different kinds of tests. We have different kinds of interviews. We have different kinds of work experiences where it really shows how a student can be more than just that student who comes into an exam hall, sits down in a chair and writes their heart out for an hour and gets something. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, I wasn't always necessarily very good at exams. I mean, I was very good at talking, and I mean, like in economics, if we were having a debate, I'd be very good. But when it came to the exam, I mean, I only ended up getting a C in the end. I mean, but ultimately, I was very good at arguing. I was very quick to think on my feet. I could relate things. But when it came to an exam, I wasn't at my best. And ultimately, that kind of like hindered my view on whether I should go and pursue an economics degree, or do you know what I mean? Like, and it's a shame because I maybe could have. I have a passion for macroeconomics. I mean, I love the way the economy works. So, but instead of like kind of being pushed to go down my passion, I was kind of almost felt that I'm not going to be good enough. So I ended up taking business management because it was an easier degrry, you know. But I mean, I went to university because I thought it's the right thing to do at 16. I thought all my friends are going. My mum and dad want me to go. And I had no better advice in terms of what I should be doing. And in some respects, where like 50 years ago, when there was only accounting jobs, doctor jobs, solicitor jobs, teacher jobs, where you need a qualification to go and have a successful career, I mean, this current education system would have worked wonders. But I mean, there's so many different industries out there now where there's like they encourage innovation. They want different ideas. They want people that have got interpersonal skills, that come in and have group conversations. They can collaborate. And unfortunately, the current education system is very much focused on like kind of like that one exam, and it doesn't really like push the kids' boundaries and their mental capabilities in some respects. I mean, like you've got subjects like politics and history and economics that are so vocal, like they're such vocal subjects. I mean, if you do politics, you go to like, you want to be a member of parliament, arguing your point and like coming up with ideas, but like you're tested in a sit down exam paper that is very like just like individual, and you're not collaborating. I mean, what you should be testing in some respects is the ability to debate and like come up with ideas and go back at people. So I mean, are we like in my opinion, are we going to be preparing these children for life after school? In hindsight, I don't really think so. I mean, in the 21st century, you've got mobile phones at your disposal, literally. I mean, why do you need to memorize information down to the T and put it into an exam when it's about the application of knowledge that is really going to be tested in the real world, you know? I mean, like, what do you think schools need to do to kind of like push towards the application of knowledge being tested, opposed to just memorizing information and putting it in an exam?
Well, I think you're right in a sense, and you've actually come up on points there about mobile phones and such. Like, we've got to look at stuff like lockdown and remote learning and things like that as an opportunity rather than something that we just have to do. Yeah. For instance, like you've talked about history, politics, subjects like that. Why can't we get to a point where a big chunk of the assessment within subjects like that comes down to debate? And we can have debates now through Zoom, through Google Meet, through Teams, anything like that. I mean, there's nothing to stop me debating, for instance, with somebody up in Manchester or Newcastle or whatever. And this is where we need to have certain things like model UNs and things like that are put in place that give our students the opportunity to be able to argue their points. You're right. I'd also say as well that the way that we've gone with remote learning and the way that the number of students are working on laptops here, we've got to remember that exams are still going to be paper and pen focused. And so that's another big change here. Certain students are going to have to go back to the fact that, oh yeah, I'm working on paper and pen now, when certainly with our way of remote learning, where we're teaching every lesson digitally and live, they're all doing work on laptop, they're all typing their answers, and they're all getting that into us this way. So yeah, I think we've got to be able to take the gains that we've made here and move them on a little bit and incorporate things. I think one of the things that you were saying here about how quickly the whole world is changing in terms of skills and technologies and stuff like that. And I think you're right. If you go back 50 years, the same jobs were happening, and they were the same all the way through. Like for someone who was going to get into banking, for instance, they could talk to someone who was in banking who's 25 years older than them, and they'd tell them, well, this is how I got in, and it'll be the same way you get in. What I would say that's changed here is, what we really need to think about here is that, in a sense, it's not a generational divide, it's even a 5-year divide that's happening. And there's quite a big role here, I think, for those who are either in university and in the last year of university or just out of university, to go back into schools and be able to say, look, here's where the job market is now. Here are the big changes that are happening now. And here's what you've got to think about. Now, that's a very difficult thing for governments to sort of think about and give power to certain students and people who are just out of university and doing their own startup companies and stuff like that. But if we're going to move things on really quickly, then certain risks are going to have to be taken. And you're totally right. There are certain GCSEs, in a sense, that just aren't really fit for purpose in a way. I mean, you can get a great history GCSE just by being a good writer.
Yeah.
There are students who I teach in history, for instance, who can talk a wonderful game, but then it comes to the actual writing of the questions and they'll struggle through. They'll get a grade 5, but their verbal history sort of being able to get their ideas across, it's a grade 8, easy, every time.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I mean, like in some respects, those kids might be highlighted in when they're looking for jobs, because I mean, as an employer, I can't see what their personal skills and their interpersonal skills, their confidence skills, their level of grit, their courage, it's not shown from the GCSE grades. I mean, do you think we kind of need a form of assessment to assess that for them to be able to put on their CVs for employers to look at too?
Yeah, it's difficult. Again, like, I think that a lot of this lies in technology. A lot of what students can do nowadays can be sort of depicted through video and stuff like that. Like, we're having a conversation now, and we're able to communicate with each other quite well. What employers should really be starting to do, perhaps, is that the interview is maybe the first stage, and that you get an idea of what a student's like, how respectful they are, what ideas they've got, all that kind of stuff, rather than looking at stuff like CVs first. And maybe there's got to be that shift in the way that we do things. Because if we're putting in stuff like CVs, and obviously they've got GCSE results and A Level results and all that kind of stuff on them, employers will obviously just cut a half of them and say, look, we're not having them, they're not meeting the criteria, and then they go on and do their interviews. Well, now we've got the ability to do it through Zoom and so on and so forth. Maybe we need to look at it the other way around, and maybe there's a different way of finding where we can give students who maybe wouldn't have their talents realised and recognised a chance. And that's, again, I'm blue sky thinking here and all that, but you never know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard though, isn't it? Because as an employer, I mean, like me, I'm very, very busy all the time. And like yourself, I mean, when you're looking for teachers, you just don't have the time, right? I mean, you've got a whole school to run. So ultimately, that's why you kind of go out to adverts or you go to an agency, is because you just don't have the time to filter through like the amount of candidates that might apply for the job. So, I mean, how are you going to be able to then kind of narrow it down and filter through the process to make sure you're not wasting your time, you know? And I think ultimately it's going to be the same for people that are high up in companies that are looking to employ and the decision makers. So what they want to do is make it efficient. So, I mean, like maybe we need to find a way to demonstrate on the CV what they're about, opposed to just kind of looking at the grades. And I think that kind of maybe needs to be in the way that we kind of assess our students and kind of demonstrate their grades. Because right now, all we see is GCSEs and they go to A levels. And in some respects, if you do a vocational subject, you're almost deemed to be not as intelligent as those kids that pick GCSEs or A levels, you know?
So no, you're absolutely right. And you've got stuff like BTECs, which you actually get some students talking down about, and it's not right, because there are certain BTECs which are the right things to do for certain students who really want to get into sport or who really want to get into health and social care and stuff like that. The BTEC is the right qualification for them, but they get talked down about, which is not really how it should be. Yeah, no, I'm in full agreement about that. I mean, you were just talking about how I find teachers, and if I'm being really honest, we get a new vice principal last year, and so I think we had something like 60 applicants. Took it down to a short list of 3, but you only really know when you meet those people on the day.
Yeah,
I would say. Other than that, they're just a lot of words on a paper. And yes, certain things like the letter of application will stand out to you, and so on and so forth. But if I'm being honest, I don't just look at grades and think, oh, they must be great, because I'll be honest, from interviews in the past that we've done, the ones with the highest grades certainly don't always amount to be the best teachers. Absolutely not.
Absolutely, I agree. I mean, I've had situations where because I work with a lot of graduates that have just come out of university and that are looking to get into teaching. And I remember a time where a school asked for Russell Group graduates specifically. And I had 2 graduates. One wasn't a Russell Group, one was a Russell Group. But I absolutely believed in the one that wasn't Russell Group. And I said, look, this person's got the grit. They're going to come in, they're going to work hard. But they didn't want to see this person. They only want to see the Russell Group person. And guess what? They didn't get the job, you know, and it just shows that it's like not everything is on paper. I mean, there is so much more to somebody than just like what grades they get. And this is ultimately what we need to do in education, is to kind of to evolve education, to make sure that we are making it possible for those kids that aren't academically that like bright or are brilliant at exams. We need to still give them opportunities, because unless you're in an independent school where academic is really high, or you're in a state school where you're part of the 15% that do really well in academics, the rest of the 85% kind of get left behind or get forgotten about. And that is what we need to change, because that's the majority of the population of the students, you know. And are we? So my question would be, like, are we letting these students down as a nation?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I mean, we've also got to look at what the role of school is within communities, and we've got to also think about the effects of what the pandemic are going to be moving forward, and think about things moving forward. You've had, for instance, all these charity organisations who are really struggling. Well, what can schools do moving forward to help within that? What can students do to prove that they're altruistic and they want to really help their community? Can they get out there and I'm not saying give qualifications for this, but can they get out there and litter pick? Can they get out there and really benefit the local community? Can they get out there? I mean, it's not safe to right now, but can they get out there and provide some kind of service to elderly homes and really help them and provide something far more tangible than, like you just say, a letter on a piece of paper? Because to me, the big things that are really memorable in my career are like the coaching the football teams to winning cups, the the taking kids on expeditions, the taking kids on trips and seeing their face light up when they really see something that's memorable and things like that. They're the things that really stick with me, not the, oh, I gave a wonderful essay, like practice lesson to this kid in Soviet Russia or whatever. Those things, yes, that's your day job, but to me, it's trying to present to students a few more kind of indelible memories that will go through their whole life about what education actually is, and what education means to them, as in making them learn new things and making them learn how to be a better person. And for a lot of students, certainly up and down the country, becoming a better person doesn't come from you teaching exam technique, or doesn't come from you teaching time management skills when you're sitting at a desk. Okay, it comes from you actually getting kids out there and saying to them, right, here's how you make a difference. Let's go and do that. And maybe schools need to find a way to provide that service.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, do you think there's too much focus on data input? Because ultimately, we were talking a little bit earlier about kind of like the impacts of obviously having a very structured school and making it very regimented, because like some people, like again, would argue that it kills individuality. And ultimately, do you think like the data input, like it promotes that, it kind of kills the the individuality and the creativity, and does there need to be a shift from that?
Yeah, I think of course it does, because in a sense, when you're looking at the data, you're looking at a spreadsheet and you're looking at a big bunch of numbers, which dehumanize.
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
It takes away the whole context. I mean, look, I mean, you would probably have days where you're not at your absolute best, and that won't be because you're any worse a person within your profession than you were the day before. It's just things are happening in your mind. And so, yeah, data entry, I can understand the need for it, but like you alluded to earlier, if you link league tables to everything, then you're really creating a pretty toxic environment. If you're saying to a teacher, for instance, for their appraisal targets that they must get this percentage of kids in an A, B, or C grade, you're putting pretty unrealistic expectations on them. And if you say something like that they failed their appraisal because some poor kid had a personal tragedy and they got a D grade and it's the teacher's fault, what kind of climate and environment are we really making here? And that is the thing. It's trying to show that there is more than just how they've done, and that is it. And it's trying to measure students by more than that. I mean, there's a bit of an argument, and I almost would have this for how do we really assess the quality of lessons? Do we go in and observe lessons and say it's up to that standard and it's up to that kind of level? That's a very difficult thing to do for me. What you should really be taking here is the long-term view, and that's asking students and asking the people who are in those lessons periodically, how much are you learning? What are you learning? How are you learning best? And really looking for the long-term picture within schools, and not these kind of snapshots that sometimes, I mean, I can remember going back to one of the schools that I taught in, being observed and not doing a great lesson. And all of a sudden you're kind of looked upon by a senior leadership team as someone who's not as proficient as they really are. When I knew I was really good at doing my job, but it would get me down in terms of morale, thinking that they don't see me that way, when in reality, what I'm trying to do here is do my absolute best every day. But some days, whatever happens, it's just not with you. And that's why I think it's almost important. Well, it's definitely far more important to look at the long term here, right? Why can't we be having a little chat with students every 2 weeks, every month, to say, right, look, what do you think of these lessons? How are they going? What do you think of these? Yeah. Are they getting the most out of them? How are you as a learner? And it's the little and often approach, rather than this big, like you say, where you've got an exam at the end of the year, and if you do well in that, great. But what if a student had an off day? What if they went into that exam with a headache that they were too shy to ask about, and they performed to 60-50% of their usual level, and that's what they've got at the end of it? We've got to look at life as far more than just a little snapshot of how good they are.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's people that will argue for data input till the cows come home, and that's because they believe they basically don't understand. I mean, they would argue that how else are you meant to measure if you're doing well as a school and what you need to do better? I mean, what's the argument against that?
Well, I mean, we still do data entry, which is we'll do something called a Cat4 test when they come into us as a student, and then we'll look at how they do in their exams and we'll measure that. But from our perspective, we do assessment a lot, but we don't do assessment for the purpose of telling students how good they are or how bad they are. We do assessment for the purpose of telling students where they've got to go, what they've got to do to improve, how they've got to look at a bit of work that they've done and how they can be self-reflective and bring themselves forward from that. So it's all about what you're using data for. I think using data to judge students is a problem. Using data to inform students, that's fine. My argument would be, however, I mean, the argument against the sort of, well, you don't need data at all is, well, how else would you do it? And I get what they're saying, but what we tend to look at as our main indicator of success is something called a progress score or value added, which is where we'll look at a student in that Cat4 test and we'll say, right, okay, that's what that test has told us you're meant to get. And we'll always set targets that are above that, because we'll say to students that you can try and get that and try and get that and try and get that. And we'll always challenge ourselves for them to do the best that they can possibly be. But we always make sure throughout the whole time that students are here that we make it clear that you're not a failure, whatever you get, as long as you're putting in full effort. So where they should feel bad within themselves is if, like, they in a homework they've just not tried or whatever, and that's what we want to see as a really bad thing, right? If they go into a test and they do badly but they've tried their best, okay, well, we'll work with that. But if they went into a test or they went into some kind of essay that they've got to hand in and they haven't been bothered to try their best, that's what I see as the real key thing. And it's trying to teach kids on a daily basis, like, what success looks like, yes, but not to get bogged down in results more than anything. There are certain schools of thought, for instance, that you shouldn't give kids their exam results in terms of a grade, and you shouldn't give them exam results in terms of a percentage, but you should just give them how to get better until they get to the real thing. But that's a very tricky, risky way to go as well. I think it's a very difficult thing to come up with an answer to. Our way, I think how I like doing it our way is we're always trying to build a student's confidence, and trying to say to them, look, if you gave full effort, I'm right behind you. But if you didn't give full effort, you got to think about what you're doing for the teacher here, for your parents who are trying to help you out here by giving you a chance here. And it's trying to get the kid to look within and say to themselves, right, I need to give of my best, and then see what happens then. And if I haven't done that, how can I do that? How can I improve to make that happen?
Sure. Like, just to kind of on the flip side and just playing devil's advocate a little bit, I mean, are we focusing too much on trying to create that kind of culture when we should be maybe encouraging them to explore their passion and actually kind of go ahead with that and kind of pushing them towards that? Because I've heard of stories in schools where they've transformed the curriculum. What they've done is that they've actually spent less time on the core subjects. Like, this is in primary level, but ultimately, this is Alison Crew, actually, a primary school in North London. But primary school got rated one of the best primary schools for the 7 years in a row or something, because she changed the curriculum. She took out the amount of maths, science and English that was essentially required by Ofsted, but she added in like a musical instrument to every single student's sort of curriculum, and basically said, we'll pay for it, but if you don't practice at home, then your parents will have to pay for the lessons. And what they found was that even though that they spent less time on the core subjects, well, actually, all of their attainment grades went up and were the best in London. So, I mean, like, are we kind of focusing too much on trying to work on these subjects that we deem to be important, but not actually teaching them how to be passionate about something which they can then replicate to the other subjects?
Yeah, and I guess the changes that you've just talked about there, what I would think in terms of characteristics that would have brought would have been stuff like discipline, taking pride in themselves to make sure this happens and that happens. And that sounds like a really interesting risk and experiment to take, I guess. I know that there are certain expectations and requirements that we must uphold, like you must do certain things within a curriculum. So it's yeah, I mean, to me, the big thing is making sure it's as varied as possible. And you're right, ensuring that every single student gets the chance to push the boundaries and find something that they are really into. I mean, we've got certain students at this school, for instance, who we've got one student who is training with a championship football club, and we try and ensure that he's got his time to do that. And we've molded his timetable with a couple of one-to-one lessons here or there to enable him to do that, because that's what he really wants to do. And that's great. Yeah, I think it's vital that you keep kids happy. And one thing that's always stuck with me is the idea that kids will learn always best when the learning and the education's on their terms, when they feel like they're, in essence, the captain of their ship. Like, if you can make certain kids take French or Spanish, but if they just don't have the kind of nous and they just don't really want to do it, you'll find it very hard to get full effort and a good grade out of them. But I mean, we've got certain kids at this college who I know are wonderful at computer science, and they're well advanced in it, and it's absolutely brilliant to see these things. It's just, I guess, for heads and for any teachers to be armed with the knowledge of, how do I get even more out of this kid? How do I push them even further? Because the worst thing within that would be this kid who's really interested in computer science and he emerges from GCSE with a 7 or whatever, but you know deep down that although he didn't know everything and able to get a 9, I'd love to see him recognised for, yeah, he got a 7, but he can do this and he can do this and he can do this. And employers actually knowing that. Yeah. And I guess probably eventually the big thing that will need to change a little bit is the whole university applications procedure. A lot more should be placed on, like, how strong their application is, how strong those teacher references is, how many extra things they've done. And then if you worked upon a system where they sat exams and they got the results a little bit earlier, then we could have the whole university applications / allocations process maybe in that month of August. But university being able to take time over it and look at every application properly and make shortlist based first and foremost on quality of applications, then results, rather than what it is right now, which is predicted results, which, to be brutally honest, from all the schools up and down the countries in terms of predicted UCAS grades, don't really mean a huge amount. And then they're going on to looking at references, then they're going on to looking at your applications, which is the wrong way around again. And it's maybe looking at how we change it up. Like you're talking about that head in North London who decided that, look, music as an appendage is how it's always been. Let's shift it around. Let's have a look at how it might be if you totally turned it around and see what would happen. So yeah, we've got to try these things, because if schools like the one you talked about in North London hadn't tried these things, we wouldn't know that worked, and we wouldn't know that we can take that from it. Just like I'm quite glad to be in the position I'm in here, because if we weren't doing what we were doing, we wouldn't know that'd work either.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's two things here. I mean, just in terms of the North London head teacher, I mean, I was in a meeting with 34 head teachers the other night, organised by Heads Up for HT, and they're talking about the way that assessment is carried out in the UK, and they're very big advocates of changing it. So, I mean, they were in this conversation. Alison spoke about her school in North London, but just to kind of re-emphasise what she said, I mean, there was another head teacher in a different school outside of London, but what they done was, instead of music, they replicated that model, but they used sport instead, and their performance was so low. But when they implemented the sport strategy and actually brought that in, they became one of the top performers in the borough. So I mean, like, it's not about moving away from actually the core knowledge, but it's about inspiration and like driving that passion and actually encouraging them to work it in a disciplined way and show character. And I think ultimately that's one thing that a basic curriculum doesn't do. And then the second point I was going to make on that is there's a gentleman called Tom Wolper who's actually been on the podcast, which we'll show later in season, but he's basically created a brand new school called New England Innovation Academy in the US, and he's working with MIT, one of the directors at MIT University, kind of about how they use the assessment, because they scrapped exams completely. And what basically at the heart of the school is innovation. So they've got an innovation lab. So So instead of like a school having the core subjects and then innovation going around it, what they've done is they completely flipped it on its head and actually like focused on the kids' niche, and then they'll have time to go into the innovation lab for most of the day and actually work on actually being innovative with that subject. And they've created a whole model on how that assessment is now going to be transferred into universities. And actually MIT have said it will be able to compete with kids that are like going through the academic process. So, I mean, it can be done, but it's a very brave and bold move to do. But I mean, that's on the very...
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah. Like you say, brave and bold, but somebody's got to do it. And it's great to hear of these things, because if you had a situation in a scenario where nobody was, very depressing, very, very depressing.
But it's good to hear that there's stuff like that going on, you know, and in some respects, it's kind of what's egged this podcast on a little bit, because when I first started, I didn't have any idea what kind of stuff goes on, because I thought it's very normal, like to have a behaviour management policy. And in fact, I actually encourage it. When I was an education recruiter, I am still an education recruiter, but earlier on in my career, I mean, schools that had bad behaviour, I would encourage teachers not to go there, because they'd struggle if I felt they weren't going to fit in terms of personality. But ultimately, like now it's all kind of been flipped. And I'm kind of now considering whether that's the right thing to do, you know. And I mean, it's beautiful to see that these journeys are happening in education, and that's the beautiful thing about education. It's forever evolving, and like teachers who promote learning that kind of feel they can't learn themselves are kind of being a little bit hypocritical in some respects, aren't they? Because education can always change, you know.
Well, yeah, I think it's the biggest danger is that you, in a sense, you find something that you make it better, even though it feels like it's wonderful right now. How can I make it even better? How can I make the school that I'm working even better? How can I make my practice even better? And if we don't continue feeling like that, and if we don't continue making teachers and sort of producing teachers who think like that, then we're going to struggle moving forward. Because like you say, and like we've discussed, the situation's changing so quickly now. It's not like it was 50 years ago, where you have very static jobs. People, like your son becomes what you were, and so on and so forth. It's just not going to happen anymore. And we need to keep pushing. Yeah. Yeah,
amazing. I mean, it sounds like you've got the right ideas, Allan, and it sounds like you're going to do some amazing things at Ealing Independent College, and I'm rooting for you, mate. I mean, I'm looking forward to see what kind of transformations you make in the next sort of 12 to 18 months. I mean, is there anything you'd kind of want to say just before we call it?
Not really. Just thanks very much for having me on. I mean, I think it's really important, certainly in this day and age, and at this time of the pandemic, where you get an awful lot of teachers who are getting a very bad press, and head teachers and unions and so on, and the whole real education sector is getting quite a bad press. I just think it's quite important that we do show, at the end of the day, parents up and down the country, everyone up and down the country, that the be all and end all here is that we really care for the And so I just want to continue doing that. And that's all I really want to say. I hope that somewhere down the line it becomes really clear that the government values teachers, values education, the vast majority of teachers up and down the country.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I mean, we'll leave it there. But Allan, you've been wonderful. I mean, you're so refreshing, and it's great to see a new head coming up with the right ideas. And I'm hoping that the more people that listen and kind of jump on board will realise, you know what? I mean, we need to make more of an impact on the majority of children, opposed to just the selected few. And I think you've got the right ideas. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your words of wisdom. And obviously, for everyone that's watching, thank you for watching as usual. And I mean, it's an absolute pleasure having you, Allan. So thanks for coming on. And guys, I'll see you next week.
Thank you very much, TJ. Thanks.
Thanks, Allan.